In 1952, the composer John Cage walked into a room designed to be the quietest place on Earth, a chamber engineered to eliminate every possible sound. He expected silence. What he heard instead was his own nervous system humming and his blood circulating. True emptiness, it turned out, was something the world wouldn't allow. That discovery sits at the heart of a question that has quietly haunted every century of human thought. Why is there something rather than nothing? It sounds simple. 6 words a child could ask, but the longer you sit with it, the larger it gets, until it starts to feel less like a question and more like the ground shifting beneath you. Tonight, we're going to follow that feeling and see where it leads. There's a passage in a novel published in 1938, written by a young Jean-Paul Sartre, that does something most philosophy books never manage. It makes you feel the question in your stomach. The character's name is Roquentin. He's sitting on a park bench in a small French town, not doing much of anything when he looks down at the roots of a chestnut tree. Black, gnarled, knotted roots pressing into the earth, and something shifts. He doesn't learn anything new. He doesn't have a thought exactly. It's more like the world suddenly drops its mask and he really sees that the roots are just there. The tree exists, the bench exists, the dirt exists, and none of it has to. That's the part that gets him, not that the world is broken or cruel or unfair. Those complaints at least imply the world owes you something. No, what overwhelms Roquentin is something quieter and stranger. Everything around him simply is, without any reason, without any necessity, without even the decency to explain itself. Existence is not necessity, Sartre writes through him. To exist is simply to be there. The roots don't justify themselves. They don't point to some deeper logic. They're just present, thick and dark and absurdly real. And then comes the nausea, actual physical nausea. Because Roquentin realizes that his own existence is no different from the trees. He is just as gratuitous, just as unexplained, just as stubbornly and pointlessly here. There's no hidden script, no backstage reason that accounts for why he or anything else should exist rather than not. The whole world, when you strip away the stories we tell about it, is just stuff heaped up, overflowing, without permission or purpose. And something about that raw factuality, that sheer there-ness of things, turns his stomach. Most people most of the time don't feel this. We move through the world with a kind of comfortable amnesia. The coffee cup is on the table, the rain is falling, okay, fine, we don't stop to be astonished or nauseated by any of it. But Sartre wanted to show what happens when that comfort slips, even for a moment, when the question sneaks up on you not as an intellectual puzzle but as a bodily experience. Why is there anything at all? It's worth sitting with that for a second, not rushing to answer it, just letting the weight of it settle. Because you're not the first person to feel the strangeness of it, and you won't be the last. A few centuries before Sartre, Blaise Pascal felt something similar, though his version was less nausea and more dread. Pascal was living through the aftermath of the Copernican revolution, that slow, disorienting realization that the Earth was not the center of anything. For most of human history, people had imagined the cosmos as something almost cozy, a set of nested crystalline spheres, the Earth at the middle, God at the edge, everything in its proper place. Finite, purposeful, legible. You could look up at the night sky and feel held. But by Pascal's time, that picture had shattered. The spheres were gone, the edges were gone, what replaced them was, well, nothing, or rather everything stretching out in every direction without end. And Pascal, who was both a brilliant mathematician and a deeply anxious human being, wrote a line in his Pensées that still lands with its full weight centuries later. The eternal silence of these infinite spaces frightens me. That word silence, it does a lot of work. The old cosmos had been noisy with meaning, full of angels and music and divine architecture. The new one just sat there, vast and indifferent and quiet, and the question of why anything exists became, for Pascal, inseparable from the terror of confronting that silence. It wasn't a question you could calmly debate over dinner. It was the kind of question that woke you up at 3 in the morning and wouldn't let you close your eyes again. He wasn't being dramatic, or, well, maybe he was a little. Pascal had a flair for it, but the feeling was real. When you strip away the assumption that the universe was made for you, made with you in mind, the bare fact of its existence stops being reassuring and starts being deeply, unsettlingly strange. Why this? Why anything? The silence doesn't answer. And then there's Wittgenstein, who came at the same mystery from an entirely different angle, not with nausea, not with terror, but with something closer to awe. Ludwig Wittgenstein was, by most accounts, one of the most unusual people to ever do philosophy. Intense, ascetic, prone to long silences and sudden bursts of insight. In 1921, he published a slim, cryptic book called the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, a book that tried, among other things, to draw a map of everything that language can and cannot say. And near the very end, in Proposition 6.44, he wrote one of the most quietly devastating sentences in the history of philosophy. Not how the world is the mystical, but that it is. Read that again slowly. Science can tell you how the world works. Physics, chemistry, biology, they describe the mechanisms, the processes, the laws, how gravity pulls, how cells divide, how light bends, but none of that touches the deeper strangeness, the fact that there is a world at all for those laws to govern. That's the mystical part, not the details, the existence. A few years later, in 1929, Wittgenstein gave a lecture on ethics at Cambridge, one of the only public lectures he ever gave, and he tried to put this feeling into words. He talked about the experience of wondering at the sheer existence of the world, seeing it, as he put it, as a miracle, not a miracle in the religious sense, with angels and trumpets. More like you're walking down the street, and for just a moment, the ordinary fact that anything is here at all becomes extraordinary. The buildings, the sky, the cracks in the pavement, all of it suddenly seems like it shouldn't be, and yet it is, and the gap between those two things opens up beneath you like a trapdoor. But here's the part Wittgenstein found most interesting and maybe most frustrating. He believed this experience, this wonder at existence, was the deepest and most important experience a person could have, the quintessential ethical experience, he called it, and yet it was something that could never be captured in any proposition. You couldn't say it, you couldn't argue it, you couldn't build a theory around it. Language, which is so good at describing how things are, goes completely silent when you try to express that things are. The deepest question of metaphysics, the one that matters most, lives permanently beyond the reach of words. Which puts us in a strange position. 3 thinkers, 3 centuries, 3 very different temperaments, and they all ended up in the same place, staring at the bare fact of existence and finding it unbearable or terrifying or miraculous. Sartre felt sick, Pascal felt afraid, Wittgenstein felt awe. But the thing they were responding to was the same. The world is here, and no one can say why. That's where we're starting tonight, not with arguments, not with proofs, just with the feeling, that quiet, persistent vertigo you get when you stop long enough to notice that anything exists at all. So that feeling, that vertigo, it isn't new. It isn't even close to new. Nearly 3,500 years ago, someone sat down in the Indus Valley and tried to put it into words. We don't know who. We don't know exactly when, somewhere around 1500 BCE, give or take a century. What we do know is that they composed a hymn. It's called the Nasadiya Sukta, the 129th hymn of the 10th book of the Rig Veda, and it opens with a line that still stops people cold. Then there was neither existence nor non-existence. Just sit with that for a second. Not in the beginning God created, not first there was chaos, but a flat, quiet denial of both options. There wasn't something, there wasn't nothing, there wasn't even a there for anything to be or not be in, no air, no sky beyond the sky, no death, so no immortality either, no distinction between night and day, just, and the hymn uses this phrase, that one thing breathless, breathed by its own nature. Whatever that means. And that's sort of the point. The poet isn't pretending to know. The whole hymn has this quality of someone thinking out loud in the dark, reaching for something they can feel but can't quite close their hand around. It moves through these negations, know this, know that, know the other thing, and you keep waiting for the turn, for the moment where the answer arrives. where the curtain gets pulled back and you see what was behind all of it. It never comes. Instead, the hymn ends with a question, and not a rhetorical one, a real one, the kind that sounds almost helpless. It asks, who really knows? Who can say where this creation came from and how it happened? Even the gods came after, they showed up later, inside the thing that had already begun. So how would they know? Maybe the one who watches over it all from the highest heaven knows the answer. Or maybe, and this is the last line, maybe even he does not. That's it, that's how it ends. No resolution, no reassurance, just a shrug aimed at the cosmos. There's something almost unsettling about finding that level of honesty in a text that old. We tend to assume ancient people had it figured out, or at least thought they did, that they had their creation myths neatly sorted, their gods assigned to their tasks, the whole machine explained. And plenty of ancient texts do work that way, but this one doesn't. This one looks at the biggest question a mind can ask and says, we don't know, we might not ever know, the gods themselves might not know. It might be the earliest expression of philosophical agnosticism about origins that we have on record. Not doubt as weakness, doubt as the only intellectually honest response to something this vast. And then, about 1,000 years later, on the other side of the world, someone took the opposite approach entirely. Parmenides of Elea, southern Italy, around 475 BCE, a philosopher who, by all accounts, was not particularly comfortable with uncertainty. Where the Vedic poet looked at the mystery of existence and said, who can say? Parmenides looked at it and said, actually, I can say. And what I can say is this, nothingness is impossible. Not just unlikely, not just hard to find, logically, conceptually, absolutely impossible. His argument is deceptively simple, and it goes something like this. Try to think about nothing, really try, not empty space, that's still something. Not darkness, that's a quality, a visual experience, still a thing. Not the absence of matter, because absence is a concept, and concepts exist in minds, and minds are something. Every time you try to point your thoughts at nothingness, you turn it into an object of thought. You give it a shape, a name, a place in your mental landscape. You make it, in some small but real sense, a thing that is. Which means the very act of conceiving nothingness refutes it. You can't think about non-being without granting it a kind of being. The attempt contradicts itself. Parmenides put it bluntly, you cannot know not being, nor even say it. The words themselves betray you. To say nothing exists is to say something about nothing, which means you're treating nothing as a subject, which means you've already smuggled existence back in through the side door. Language won't let you get there. Thought won't let you get there. There is no path to nothingness that doesn't loop back around to being. And so he declared that only one road could be followed by reason. It is, and it is not possible for it not to be. Existence is necessary, not contingent, not accidental, not the lucky outcome of some cosmic coin flip, necessary in the strongest possible sense. There is no alternative. There never was. The question, why is there something rather than nothing, doesn't just lack an answer. For Parmenides, it lacks coherence. It's like asking what's north of the North Pole. The question assumes a possibility that logic itself rules out. Now you might feel a kind of resistance to that, something in you that says, wait, I can imagine nothingness. I can close my eyes and picture a void, but Parmenides would say, who's doing the picturing, who's closing their eyes, you're still there, consciousness is still there. The void you're imagining is still a thing being imagined by someone. You haven't escaped existence, you've just dimmed the lights. It's a strange argument because it feels both airtight and somehow unsatisfying. Like being told you've won a game you didn't realize you were playing. Okay, nothingness is inconceivable, but the world still feels gratuitous. The vertigo doesn't go away just because someone proved it's logically necessary for something to exist. Sartre still felt nauseous. Pascal was still afraid. The Vedic poets still threw up their hands. And maybe that's the tension worth holding on to here. Two ancient responses to the same abyss, separated by 1,000 years and several thousand miles. One says, we cannot know. The other says, there is nothing to wonder about. Being is all there is and all there could ever be. Radical humility on one side, radical certainty on the other. and the question just sits there between them undisturbed the way it always has. So Parmenides draws this hard line: being is everything, nothingness is impossible, end of discussion. But not everyone found that satisfying. Actually, within a generation or two, a pair of thinkers from a small town in Thrace looked at that airtight argument and said, essentially, what if you're wrong? Leucippus and his student Democritus, the atomists, working in the 5th century BCE, made a move that sounds simple but was genuinely radical. They said the void is real, not just there are gaps between things in some casual, obvious way. They meant something much stranger, that emptiness itself exists, that nothingness isn't the absence of being, it's a kind of being. The void, the kenon, is an entity, it has standing. It's the stage, the infinite dark theater in which atoms drift and collide and build up everything we see and touch. Think about how strange that is, given where we just were. Parmenides had declared with real logical force that you cannot even think about non-being without turning it into something. And here come the atomists almost cheerfully, saying, yes, exactly, the void is something, that's not a contradiction, that's the point. They gave nothingness philosophical dignity. That's not a phrase you hear very often, but it matters. Before the atomists, emptiness was a scandal, a logical impossibility, a word that refuted itself the moment you spoke it. After them, it had a place at the table. The void was no longer what's left when you take everything away. It was one of the two fundamental ingredients of reality. Atoms and void, stuff and the space stuff moves through. Both equally real, both equally necessary. And that tension between being and void, between the fullness of things and the emptiness they float in, never really went away. It runs like a fault line through Western metaphysics, all the way down to quantum field theory and the arguments physicists have today about whether empty space is truly empty or seething with virtual particles. The atomists cracked something open that couldn't be closed again. But there was another idea running alongside all of this, quieter and in some ways more powerful because almost nobody questioned it. The principle ex nihilo nihil fit, nothing comes from nothing. Parmenides had planted the seed. Nothingness has no causal powers. It can't do anything. It can't push, pull, create, or transform, and so nothing could ever come from it. If there was ever a moment of pure, absolute nothing, no matter, no energy, no potential, no anything, then that's all there would ever be. Forever. The fact that something exists right now proves, by this logic, that something has always existed. This wasn't a fringe idea, it was bedrock. For something like 700 years, it was one of the few things Greek philosophers could mostly agree on, even when they agreed on almost nothing else. Plato's demiurge doesn't create from nothing, he shapes pre-existing material. Aristotle's unmoved mover doesn't conjure matter into being, it moves what's already there. The raw stuff of the universe in Greek thought was just given, eternal, uncreated. There was no moment of beginning, no flash of light out of darkness. Things had always been around in some form, rearranging themselves endlessly. Lucretius, the Roman poet who took these ideas and turned them into genuinely beautiful Latin verse around 55 BCE, pushed this even further. His poem De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things, is one of those works that feels eerily modern even though it's over 2,000 years old. And he had this wonderful, almost playful way of arguing. If things could spring from nothing, he wrote, then we'd see fish leaping out of dry fields. Lions could be born from hens. Apple trees would sprout pears one season and figs the next. The whole orderly fabric of nature, seeds producing their own kind, animals bearing young that look like them, seasons cycling in their familiar rhythm, all of that regularity is proof, Lucretius said, that matter doesn't just appear, it was always here. It transforms, recombines, falls apart and reassembles, but it never springs from nowhere. The universe, in his view, is a vast recycling project that has been running forever. There's something almost comforting about that picture, honestly. No terrifying moment of creation, no edge of the cliff where being tips into non-being, just atoms drifting through the void endlessly, the way snow drifts through a dark sky. No beginning, no end, just the quiet persistence of stuff being stuff. And then Christianity came along and broke the whole thing. Not gradually, not with a gentle philosophical revision, with a sledgehammer. The doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, creation from nothing, was a direct, deliberate contradiction of 7 centuries of Greek consensus. It said God created everything from absolute nothing, not from pre-existing material, not by shaping chaos into order, from nothing, pure, total, unqualified nothing. This wasn't even in the earliest Christian writings in any explicit form. The Hebrew Bible opens with, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth," but scholars have debated for centuries whether that implies creation from nothing or creation from some pre-existing formlessness. It was Theophilus of Antioch, writing around 180 CE, who first articulated the doctrine clearly: God alone is eternal. Everything else, matter, space, time, the void itself, was brought into being by divine will out of absolute nothingness. The theological stakes were enormous. If matter is eternal, then God isn't really the ultimate origin of things. He's a craftsman working with materials he didn't make. But if God created from nothing, truly nothing, then everything depends on him absolutely. There's no raw material that exists independently, no void that was already there waiting to be filled. The whole of reality is, in a sense, a gift that didn't have to be given. A gesture made into a darkness so complete that even the darkness didn't exist yet. It's a dizzying thought. The Greeks had spent centuries establishing that nothing comes from nothing, building their physics and their philosophy on that foundation. And here was this new tradition saying, actually, everything comes from nothing. That's the whole point. That's what makes it miraculous. Whether you find that liberating or terrifying probably says something about you. The Greek picture, eternal matter, no beginning, no end, has a certain calm to it, like falling asleep to the sound of rain that's been falling since before you were born and will keep falling long after. The Christian picture is more dramatic, a single, unrepeatable act of will, a voice speaking into silence so deep that even silence is too generous a word for it. Both are responses to the same impossible question. Both are ways of standing at the edge of that void and deciding what it means. And neither one, if you sit with them long enough, fully closes the door on the mystery. Because even if matter is eternal, you can still ask, why this eternal matter? Why atoms and void rather than something else entirely? And if God created from nothing, you can still ask, and people have relentlessly for almost 2,000 years, why did God create at all? What moved the unmoved? What broke the silence? The question just keeps regenerating, no matter how firmly you answer it, like a vine growing back through the cracks in a wall you thought you'd sealed. So those cracks in the wall, that vine growing back through every answer, somebody eventually decided to stop patching and start mapping, to trace exactly where the roots were coming from and why they kept finding a way through. That somebody was a Persian physician and philosopher named Ibn Sina, known in the Latin West as Avicenna, writing around the turn of the first millennium. And what he did was deceptively simple. He looked at everything that exists and sorted it into 2 piles. In one pile, things that could not exist. You, me, this planet, every star you've ever seen. None of it had to be here. You can conceive of a world without any particular thing in it, without Earth, without the sun, without hydrogen, without any of it. These are contingent beings. They exist, sure, but their existence isn't guaranteed by their own nature. They depend on something else. Something caused them, something sustains them, something could, in principle, remove them. In the other pile, and this pile has at most one occupant, something that cannot not exist. Something whose very nature is to exist, the way a triangle's nature is to have 3 sides. Avicenna called this wajib al-wujud, necessary existence. Not necessary in the casual way we use that word, like saying breakfast is necessary. Necessary the way logic is necessary. The kind of thing where its non-existence would be a contradiction. And here's what made his argument unusual, even among the sharpest thinkers of his era. He didn't start from the world. He didn't say, look around you, trees, mountains, people, something must have made all this. That's a perfectly reasonable move, and plenty of philosophers made it. But Avicenna went somewhere stranger. His proof, he called it the proof of the truthful, Burhan al-Siddiqin, started from the bare concept of existence itself. Not from what exists, but from the fact that existence is a thing at all. He said, if anything exists, even one thing, even just the abstract possibility of existence, then you can ask whether that thing exists necessarily or contingently. If contingently, it depends on something else. Follow the chain. You either hit something necessary eventually or you don't, and if you don't, then nothing has a sufficient reason to exist and the whole structure collapses into incoherence. It's a tighter argument than it might sound on first hearing. He's not appealing to wonder or emotion or even observation. He's saying the concept of existence itself contains, buried inside it like a seed, the requirement that something necessary anchors the whole thing. You don't need to prove the world exists first. You don't need to gesture at the night sky. You just need to think clearly about what it means for anything to be real. The terminology stuck. It stuck so thoroughly that even the thinkers who disagreed with Avicenna most fiercely, Al-Ghazali, for instance, who attacked the philosophers on multiple fronts, ended up adopting his vocabulary. Necessary and contingent, wajib and mumkin, those became the terms of the debate for centuries. When Thomas Aquinas sat down in 13th century Paris to write his Third Way, the argument from contingency, he was working with tools Avicenna had forged 200 years earlier and 5,000 kilometers to the east. When Duns Scotus refined the argument further, sharpening the logic, distinguishing different kinds of causal dependency, same toolbox. Avicenna's fingerprints are all over medieval Western philosophy, even when his name goes unmentioned. But there was another line of argument developing alongside Avicenna's, one that took the question in a slightly different direction. While Avicenna was reasoning from concepts, from the abstract architecture of existence, the mutakalimun, the practitioners of Kalam, Islamic speculative theology, were reasoning about time. Their argument went like this: think about the past, not the distant past, not billions of years, think about the structure of the past. Is it possible for an infinite number of events to have actually occurred, one after another, stretching back forever? Not as a mathematical abstraction, we can talk about infinite series in math all day, but as a real sequence of real events, each one following the last. The mutakalimun said no. An actual infinite, they argued, can't be completed by successive addition. You can't count to infinity. You can't traverse an infinite distance one step at a time. And if you can't, then the series of past events must be finite, which means the universe began to exist. And whatever begins to exist, this felt almost obvious to them, almost too simple to need statting, requires a cause. This is the Kalam cosmological argument, and it's worth pausing to notice what makes it different from what Avicenna was doing. Avicenna's proof doesn't care whether the universe had a beginning. It works even if the universe is eternal, because it's about why contingent things exist at all, not when they started. The Kalam argument, by contrast, insists on a temporal beginning. It says the origin of the universe wasn't just a logical dependency, something that could be diagrammed on a philosopher's whiteboard, but an event. A concrete moment when there was nothing and then there was something, a real transition from absence to presence. That shift matters more than it might seem, because once you frame the origin of existence as something that happened, not just as a logical relationship between concepts, but as an occurrence in or at the boundary of time, you've changed the nature of the question. You're not just asking why the structure of reality requires a foundation. You're asking what happened, what was the first event, what triggered it. What was, and here the language starts to strain, because we're using temporal words to describe something that may precede time itself. What was it like before? The mutakalimun were working this out centuries before the argument became famous in Western philosophy. Centuries before William Lane Craig revived it in the 1970s and turned it into one of the most debated arguments in contemporary philosophy of religion. The basic architecture, actual infinites can't exist, the past is finite, therefore the universe began, therefore something caused it, was already fully formed in medieval Baghdad and Basra, in the works of Al-Kindi and Al-Ghazali, and others whose names rarely appear in introductory Western philosophy courses, but probably should. And between the two of them, Avicenna mapping the logical structure of existence, the Mutakalamon insisting on a real beginning, the question had been sharpened to a point it hadn't reached before. It wasn't just a feeling anymore, not just Sartre's nausea or the Rigveda's open-palmed unknowing. It was an argument with premises and conclusions and carefully defined terms. Necessary, contingent, infinite, finite, cause, beginning. Whether those arguments actually work, whether they close the gap or just redraw it in finer lines, well, that's a question the next several centuries of philosophy would take up, and they still haven't put it down. So those carefully defined terms, necessary, contingent, cause, beginning, they didn't stay in the Islamic world, they traveled. And in 1714, a German polymath named Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz sat down and wrote a short treatise called Principles of Nature and Grace, based on reason. He was 70 years old. He had 2 years left to live. And in section 7 of that little document, he asked the question in a way that would echo through every philosophy classroom for the next 3 centuries. Why is there something rather than nothing? Just like that, 8 words, you've probably heard them before, even if you didn't know where they came from. That's Leibniz, that's section 7. And what's striking is that he didn't ask it the way the Rigveda asked it, with that beautiful, open-handed uncertainty, that willingness to sit in the not knowing. Leibniz asked it like a man who expected an answer, because he had one. His reasoning went like this. Look at anything in the world, a tree, a stone, a thought passing through your mind. It didn't have to exist. It's contingent, meaning its existence depends on something else. The tree depends on the seed depends on the tree before it. And you can trace that chain back as far as you like, but here's the thing Leibniz noticed. Even if the chain goes on forever, even if there's no first link, the chain itself is still contingent. The whole series of dependent things is just a bigger dependent thing. It doesn't explain itself any more than one domino explains why all the dominoes are falling. So there has to be something outside the chain, something whose existence doesn't depend on anything else, something necessary, and if you've been following along, you'll recognize that word from Avicenna, because Leibniz was building on exactly that foundation. A necessary being, a being that couldn't not exist, and for Leibniz, that being was God. But he went further than Avicenna had. He didn't just say God exists necessarily. He said God chose. Out of all the possible worlds, and Leibniz genuinely believed there were infinitely many possible ways reality could have been arranged, God selected this one. The best one. The one with the most perfection, the most harmony, the most reality packed into the least complexity. The best of all possible worlds. Now you might be sitting with that phrase and feeling a little skeptical. Voltaire certainly was. He wrote an entire novel, Candide, basically mocking the idea that this messy, painful, earthquake-ridden world could possibly be the best God could do, and that's fair. But the mockery sometimes obscures what Leibniz was actually trying to accomplish. He wasn't being naive. He was trying to answer the deepest version of the question, not just why does something exist, but why this particular something. Why this arrangement? Why these laws of physics and not others? Why you here now? His answer was, because a rational, necessary being chose it for sufficient reasons. You can accept that or not, but give Leibniz this much. He took the question seriously enough to demand a complete answer, and he followed his own logic wherever it led. The question had been a feeling in the Rigveda, a logical puzzle for the Greeks, a formal argument for the Islamic philosophers. Leibniz made it the cornerstone of an entire metaphysical system. He crystallized it. And then, about 200 years later, a French philosopher named Henri Bergson came along and asked a very different kind of question. Not what's the answer, but is this actually a real question at all? Bergson published an essay in 1906, later folded into chapter 4 of his book Creative Evolution, where he argued that why is there something rather than nothing is a pseudo-problem, a question that feels profound but is actually built on a mistake. The mistake, he said, is the concept of nothingness itself. Think about it for a moment. Try to imagine absolute nothing, not empty space that's still something, not darkness. Darkness is an experience, and experience is something, not a void or a vacuum or a blank canvas. Nothing, the complete absence of all things, all properties, all relations, all possibility. Can you do it? Bergson said no, and not just because it's hard, because the very attempt contradicts itself. To imagine nothing, you have to start with everything. You have to picture the whole of reality, every object, every force, every whisper of existence, and then mentally subtract it piece by piece. You remove the stars, you remove the space between the stars, you remove time, you remove the laws that govern time, and for each thing you remove, you have to hold in mind the thought of its absence. You have to think no stars, which is still a thought about stars, no space, which is still a concept of space. So the idea of nothing, Bergson argued, isn't simpler than the idea of something. It's actually more complex. It contains everything something contains, plus all the mental operations of negation. It's, as he put it, as full and comprehensive as the idea of all, to which it is very closely akin. Nothing is all, turned inside out. Which means the question, why is there something rather than nothing, smuggles in a hidden assumption that nothing is the default, the simpler state, the thing that needs no explanation, and that something is the deviation that demands one. But if nothing is actually harder to conceive than something, if it requires more intellectual machinery rather than less, then maybe the question has it backwards. Maybe existence isn't the thing that needs explaining. Maybe it's the idea of non-existence that's strange. It's a disorienting move. Leibniz spent his career building the most elegant possible answer to the question, and Bergson, without exactly disagreeing with any of Leibniz's premises, just dissolved the question, pulled it apart at the seams, said, you think you're asking something deep, but you're actually chasing a phantom, the phantom of nothingness, an idea that can't even hold itself together when you look at it closely. And the funny thing is, both of them might be right, or at least, both of them might be pointing at something real. Leibniz is right that contingent things seem to cry out for explanation, that the chain of causes feels incomplete without something anchoring it. And Bergson is right that our intuition about nothing being simpler than something might be an illusion, a trick of language, a concept we assembled without noticing how many parts it has. They're standing on opposite sides of the same gap, really. Leibniz looking across and saying, there must be a bridge. Bergson looking down and saying, I'm not sure there's actually a gap. And that tension between the demand for an ultimate explanation and the suspicion that the demand itself might be confused, that tension is going to run through everything that comes next, because the 20th century picked up both threads and pulled. And pull they did. Martin Heidegger arrived at the University of Freiburg in 1929 as its new professor of philosophy, and for his inaugural lecture he chose a question that most of his colleagues in the sciences would have considered either solved or nonsensical. He asked, what is metaphysics? But what he really wanted to talk about was nothing. Literally nothing. Not the absence of some particular thing, not an empty chair or a missing friend, but nothingness as such, the whole of it, capital N nothing. Now Heidegger had a way of speaking that could make even sympathetic readers squint. He was not trying to be clear in the way a logician is clear. He was trying to describe something that, by its very nature, resists description. And the sentence he produced, the one that would follow him around for the rest of his life and well beyond it, was this, das Nichts selbst nichtet, the nothing itself nothings. Which, yeah, that sounds like a parody of philosophy. It sounds like something you'd generate if you fed 1,000 pages of German metaphysics into a machine and asked it to produce the most impenetrable sentence possible. And Rudolf Carnap, the logical positivist, thought exactly that. He held this sentence up as the supreme example of metaphysical nonsense, proof that traditional philosophy had degenerated into language chasing its own tail, producing grammatically valid sentences that meant absolutely nothing. The irony of using a sentence about nothing to demonstrate that something means nothing was probably not lost on Carnap, though he wasn't the type to dwell on ironies. But here's the thing, and I think this is worth sitting with for a moment. Heidegger wasn't just being obscure for the sake of it, or at least that wasn't all he was doing. He was trying to point at something genuinely difficult to articulate. His claim was that nothingness is not simply a logical negation, not the result of sticking not in front of a statement. It's something you can actually encounter, something that reveals itself. And the way it reveals itself, he said, is through anxiety. Not fear. Fear always has an object, something specific you're afraid of. Anxiety is different. Anxiety is what happens when, for a moment, all the familiar things around you, your work, your plans, the objects on your desk, the people you know, all of it becomes somehow superfluous. It slips away, not physically. Everything is still right where it was. But it loses its grip on you, or you lose your grip on it, and what you're left with is this uncanny suspension. You're just there, existing, with nothing underneath you and nothing holding you up. And in that moment, Heidegger thought nothingness isn't an abstract concept anymore. It's doing something, it's active. It's pressing in on you from every direction, and what it's revealing, by contrast, is the sheer strangeness that anything exists at all. The nothings, which is to say, nothingness performs itself, enacts itself, makes itself felt, not as an idea but as an experience, as a mood. Carnap wanted no part of this. For him, meaningful statements were either empirically verifiable or logically tautological, and Heidegger's sentence was neither. It was, in Carnap's precise and devastating phrase, a pseudo-statement, something that wears the costume of meaning without actually having any. And honestly, there are days when I think Carnap had a point. There are also days when I think Carnap was like someone who insists that music is just vibrating air, technically correct, and yet somehow missing everything that matters. The argument between them wasn't really about one sentence. It was about whether philosophy is allowed to describe experiences that don't translate cleanly into propositions, whether there's something real happening when a person lies awake at 3 a.m. and feels the floor of ordinary life give way beneath them. Heidegger said yes, and tried to build an entire philosophical vocabulary around it. Carnap said the vocabulary was empty. And the 20th century, in its way, never quite resolved the disagreement. But Heidegger wasn't the first to take the question of existence somewhere dark. About a century before that Freiburg lecture, Arthur Schopenhauer had already been there, and he'd taken it further. Schopenhauer didn't approach the question, why is there something rather than nothing, as a puzzle to be solved. He approached it as something closer to a wound. A man finds himself, to his great astonishment, suddenly existing, he wrote, after thousands and thousands of years of non-existence. He lives for a little while, and then again comes an equally long period when he must exist no more. Read that slowly. There's an immense silence on either side of that sentence, the vast darkness before birth and the vast darkness after death, and between them this brief, bewildered flicker of consciousness. And Schopenhauer's point wasn't that existence is a gift. His point was that it's an imposition. You didn't ask for this. You weren't consulted. You simply appeared, blinking and confused, and one day you'll disappear again just as suddenly, and the universe will continue on as though you'd never been here at all. For Schopenhauer, the sheer contingency of your own existence, the fact that you so easily might not have been, was not cause for wonder or gratitude. It was cause for something more like horror, a quiet, persistent horror that hums beneath the surface of daily life. He maintained, with characteristic bleakness, that we have not to be pleased but rather sorry about the existence of the world, that its non-existence would be preferable to its existence. The best possible outcome in Schopenhauer's view would have been nothing at all. No world, no consciousness, no one around to ask why. This is the same question Leibniz asked, why something rather than nothing, but Schopenhauer has rotated it 180 degrees. Leibniz heard the question and reached for God for sufficient reason, for the comforting idea that existence has a purpose. Schopenhauer heard it and recoiled. The question wasn't an invitation to explain, it was an occasion to grieve. And there's something oddly honest about that reaction, because most of the answers we've encountered so far, the necessary being, the principle of sufficient reason, even Bergson's elegant dissolution, they all share an implicit assumption that the question deserves a reassuring answer, that if we can just explain why there's something, we can make peace with it. Schopenhauer wasn't interested in making peace. He thought the appropriate response to finding yourself inexplicably alive in an inexplicable world was dismay. Not dramatic despair, he wasn't theatrical about it. Just a steady, clear-eyed refusal to pretend that existence was a favor anyone had done him. So by the early 20th century, the question had split into at least two very different kinds of darkness. There was Heidegger's darkness, the anxiety of confronting nothingness directly, the dizzying experience of watching everything familiar become strange. And there was Schopenhauer's darkness, the horror of contingency, the recognition that your life is a brief accident bracketed by infinite absence. One philosopher staring into the void and finding it strangely alive. The other staring into existence and wishing it had stayed void. Neither of them answered the question, but they both changed what it felt like to ask it. And then, somewhere around the turn of the millennium, a philosopher named Bede Rundle tried something different. He didn't try to answer the question, he tried to disqualify it. Rundle published a book in 2004 with a deceptively simple thesis. The problem with asking, why is there something rather than nothing, isn't that we lack a good answer. It's that the alternative, the nothing part, doesn't actually make sense. Not in some loose, hand-wavy way, in a precise, grammatical way. The sentence, there is nothing, is, he argued, fundamentally incomplete. It's like saying she went. Went where? There is nothing. Nothing what? Nothing in the fridge. Nothing under the bed. Nothing worth watching tonight. Fine, those all work, but there is nothing at all anywhere in any sense. That, Rundle said, isn't a coherent thought. It's a sentence that looks like it means something but quietly collapses when you lean on it. His reasoning was careful and it had a certain elegance. Think about what we're really doing when we try to conceive of absolute nothingness. We're trying to imagine a state of affairs in which no state of affairs obtains. We're trying to describe a situation in which there's nothing to describe. We're using concepts, possibility, absence, emptiness, that themselves depend on there being a world in which things can be possible, absent, or empty. Abstractions don't float free. They need something concrete underneath them. The number 7 doesn't exist in a void. The possibility of rain doesn't hover in a world where there's nothing to be possible. Even the idea of nothingness borrows its meaning from the existence of things that could, in principle, be absent. So when you say there might have been nothing, you're smuggling in a framework, a logical space, a set of possibilities, a background of reality that already constitutes something. You can't get to zero. The very act of conceiving nothingness presupposes a world in which conceiving happens. It's a strange kind of argument, not a proof that something must exist exactly, more like a demonstration that the question is broken, that asking, why is there something rather than nothing, is a bit like asking what's north of the North Pole. The grammar works, the meaning doesn't. And there's something genuinely relieving about Rundle's position if you accept it. All those centuries of anguish, Leibniz packing, Heidegger spiraling, Schopenhauer recoiling, and maybe the whole thing was a linguistic mirage. Maybe nothing was never a real alternative. Maybe asking why something exists rather than nothing is like worrying about why you're alive rather than being a square circle. The alternative was never on the table, so there's nothing to explain. You can almost feel the tension draining out of the question, like setting down a weight you didn't realize you were carrying. But here's the thing about philosophy. Every time someone tries to close a door, someone else wedges it back open. 8 years before Rundle published his argument, A philosopher named Thomas Baldwin had already constructed a thought experiment that seems to show exactly what Rundle says is impossible. And it's disarmingly simple. Baldwin asks you to imagine a world, not our world, just a possible world. This one contains a finite number of objects, could be anything. Rocks, particles, strange glowing orbs, doesn't matter. The point is there's a definite, countable number of them. Say 17. Now remove 16 objects. That's clearly a possible world too, just a slightly emptier one. There's nothing incoherent about a universe with 16 things in it instead of 17. Remove another 15, still fine. Keep going 14, 11, 7, 3. Each step is perfectly intelligible. Each subtraction gives you a world that's a little barer, a little quieter, but still a world you can wrap your mind around. 2 objects, just 2 things hanging in the void, then 1. A single lonely something existing for no particular reason. And then, you remove the last one. 0. Baldwin's subtraction argument, that's what philosophers call it, doesn't prove that nothingness is actual. It just suggests that it's conceivable, that you can get there step by step through a series of moves that are each individually unproblematic. If a world with one object is possible, and if removing an object from a possible world gives you another possible world, then an empty world is possible too. The logic is almost boringly simple. It's just subtraction. 3 minus 1 is 2. 2 minus 1 is 1. 1 minus 1 is 0. But 0 in this case means no objects at all, no space, no time, no laws, no potential, absolute nothingness. And if that's genuinely possible, if an empty world is something we can coherently think about, then the question comes roaring back. Why isn't that the world we got? Why is there all of this instead of none of it? It's the kind of thought experiment that seems almost too easy. And philosophers have pushed back on it. Some argue that the subtraction only works for objects, not for space itself or for abstract entities. Others argue that removing an object from a possible world isn't as straightforward as it sounds. Maybe some objects are necessary. Maybe the last one can't be subtracted because its existence is woven into the fabric of what makes anything possible. But the damage, if you can call it that, is done. The image lingers, that slow countdown. 17, 16, 15, 3, 2, 1, and then the quiet that comes after. Baldwin didn't need to prove that nothingness is real. He just needed to show that you can think it, that your mind can follow the path all the way down to 0 and not hit a wall of incoherence along the way. Which puts us in an odd position. Rundle says nothingness is literally unthinkable, that our language breaks before it gets there. Baldwin says no, look, here's a perfectly clear path to it, just count backwards. And honestly, both of them are compelling. When Rundle explains how abstractions and possibilities need a world to live in, you nod. When Baldwin walks you through the subtraction, you nod at that too. They can't both be right, but sitting with them side by side, late at night, it's hard to know which one to trust. Maybe that's the real takeaway from this particular skirmish. Not a resolution, but a sharpening. The question, why is there something rather than nothing, isn't just hard to answer. It's hard to even ask properly. We can't quite agree on whether the alternative, the nothing, is a genuine possibility or a grammatical illusion. And until we sort that out, the question just hangs there, patient, unresolved, glowing faintly in the dark. So far we've been living in the world of philosophy. Arguments, counter-arguments, definitions that slip through your fingers. But the question, why is there something rather than nothing, doesn't belong to philosophers alone. At some point it wandered into the physics lab, and what it found there is, if anything, stranger than anything Leibniz or Heidegger ever dreamed up. Because here's what physicists discovered when they looked very, very closely at nothing. It isn't empty. Take a region of space, remove everything from it. Every atom, every photon, every stray particle of dust, cool it down to absolute 0, shield it from every possible influence. What you're left with is what physicists call the quantum vacuum, the closest thing our universe offers to pure emptiness. And it's buzzing. Not with anything you could see or touch, but at scales far smaller than atoms, the vacuum is alive with a kind of restless fidgeting. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle, one of the bedrock rules of quantum mechanics, says that you can never pin down both the energy of a system and the duration of that energy with perfect precision. There's always a little blur, a little slack in the measurement, and nature, it turns out, exploits that slack constantly. What happens is this: pairs of particles, a particle and its antiparticle twin, flicker into existence out of nothing. They borrow a tiny amount of energy from the vacuum itself, materialize for an almost inconceivably brief moment, and then annihilate each other and vanish. The energy is returned, the books balance, and it happens again and again, everywhere all the time, at every single point in space. These are called virtual particles, and the name is a little misleading. They're not imaginary. They have measurable effects. They shift the energy levels of atoms. They alter the force between charged particles. They leave fingerprints in experiments that physicists have confirmed again and again. They're called virtual only because they're too short-lived to be observed directly. They exist in the gaps between measurements, in the blur of uncertainty, borrowing their way into being and then slipping back out before anyone can catch them. Which means that the vacuum, this thing we call empty space, is really more like an ocean. A dark, silent ocean that looks perfectly still from a distance, but when you press your face close to the surface, you see it churning, frothing with potential, particles winking in and out of reality so quickly that the overall effect is a kind of trembling stillness, a nothing that can't sit still. There's something deeply unsettling about that if you sit with it long enough. All those centuries of philosophers debating whether nothingness is even coherent, whether the absence of everything is something the mind can genuinely grasp, and meanwhile, down at the foundations of physical reality, the universe seems to have already answered. Nothingness is unstable. It can't sustain itself. Even the most perfect emptiness we can construct immediately begins generating some things, as if the void has a kind of allergy to its own emptiness. As if being is the default state and nothing is the thing that requires effort. That's a remarkable thought, not just that something exists, but that nothing, true, absolute, featureless nothing, might be physically impossible. That the laws of quantum mechanics don't permit it. That the moment you clear a space completely, reality rushes back in to fill it, even if only with these ghostly, flickering half-particles that vanish before they fully arrive. You could almost find that comforting in a strange way. The universe doesn't want to be empty. But then comes the embarrassment. Because if the vacuum really is seething with all of this activity, all these virtual particles constantly popping in and out of existence, then it should contain energy. Quite a lot of energy, actually. Every one of those fluctuations carries a tiny amount, and when you add them all up across all possible frequencies and all possible types of particles, you get a number. And the number is absurd. When physicists sit down and calculate how much energy the quantum vacuum should contain, based on everything we know about quantum field theory, they arrive at a figure that is roughly 10 to the power of 120 times larger than what we actually observe. That's not a small error. That's not even a large error. That is the single worst quantitative prediction in the entire history of physics. A mismatch of 120 orders of magnitude. To put that in some kind of perspective, though honestly no perspective really captures it, the number of atoms in the observable universe is only about 10 to the 80th power. The discrepancy between theory and observation for the vacuum energy is a trillion times larger than that. This is called the vacuum catastrophe, and the name is barely an exaggeration. What it means in plain language is this: our best theory of how reality works at the smallest scales, quantum field theory, which is staggeringly accurate in almost every other prediction it makes, completely falls apart when asked the simplest possible question about empty space. How much energy does nothing contain? We don't know. We thought we knew, and we were wrong by a number so large that it borders on meaningless. And this isn't some fringe puzzle that only bothers specialists. The energy of empty space, what cosmologists call the cosmological constant, is directly connected to the expansion of the universe. It shapes the fate of everything. Whether the cosmos will expand forever, whether galaxies will eventually drift out of each other's sight, whether the whole story of reality ends in cold darkness or something else entirely, all of that depends on a quantity we cannot currently explain. So here we are. Physics tells us that nothing is unstable, that emptiness seethes with activity, that the void cannot maintain itself. And in the very same breath, physics admits that it has no idea why the void behaves the way it does. The quantum vacuum is real, its energy is measurable, but the gap between what our theories predict and what the universe actually shows us is so vast that it amounts to a confession. We do not understand nothing, not even a little. Which puts the physicist in a surprisingly similar position to the philosopher. Both have spent centuries circling this question, approaching it from radically different directions, using completely different tools, and both have arrived at more or less the same place, standing at the edge of an explanation that almost works, staring at the part that doesn't, wondering what they're missing. The question persists, not because nobody has tried to answer it, but because every answer, so far, opens onto something deeper. And in the 1980s, a few physicists decided to try something audacious. Not just to describe the universe's early moments, or to model what happened after the Big Bang, but to explain how everything, space, time, matter, all of it, could have come from nothing at all. The first serious attempt came from a cosmologist named Alexander Vilenkin. In 1982, he published a paper with a title that sounds almost reckless, Creation of Universes from Nothing. And he meant it, not nothing in the loose sense, not empty space, not a quantum vacuum humming with potential energy, not some dormant field waiting to be disturbed. He meant nothing, no space, no time, no matter, no laws. A state so bare that even calling it a state feels like saying too much, because there's no framework in which a state could exist. What Vilenkin proposed was that the universe emerged from this absolute nothing through quantum tunneling. Now, quantum tunneling is something physicists already understood reasonably well by then. It's the process by which a particle crosses a barrier it shouldn't have enough energy to cross. It doesn't go over or around the barrier, it just appears on the other side as if it slipped through a crack in probability itself. It's strange, but it's well documented, measurable, real. Vilenkin's leap was to apply this idea not to a particle trapped in a well, but to the entire universe. The universe, he suggested, tunneled into existence from literally nothing, popping into being as a tiny, closed, inflating bubble of spacetime, a de Sitter space in the technical language, and from there, inflation took over, stretching that bubble into something vast. The remarkable thing about Vilenkin's proposal is what it doesn't need. It requires no initial conditions, no boundary conditions, no setup, no trigger, no prior cause. There's nothing before it because there's no before for anything to occupy. The tunneling event doesn't happen inside time, it produces time. It doesn't occur within space, it generates space. The whole framework is designed to be self-starting, like a match that lights itself in a room that doesn't exist yet. A year later, Stephen Hawking and James Hartle came at the same problem from a different angle, and their proposal might be even stranger. They didn't try to explain the moment of creation. They tried to make it disappear. Their approach is called the no-boundary proposal, and it hinges on a mathematical technique called Wick rotation. Essentially, you replace ordinary time with what physicists call imaginary time. Not imaginary in the everyday sense, like fictional or made up, but imaginary in the mathematical sense, involving the square root of -1. When you do this, something peculiar happens to the geometry of the early universe. The sharp point of the Big Bang, that singularity where density becomes infinite and the equations break down, smooths out. It rounds off, the way the tip of a cone might soften into something more like the surface of a sphere. And on a sphere there's no edge, no boundary, no starting point. You can move across the surface in any direction and never hit a wall, never reach a place where the surface begins. That's the idea Hawking and Hartle applied to time itself. In their model, the universe is finite, it has a definite age, a definite size, but it has no boundary in time. There's no first moment, no instant where the clock starts ticking. The question, what happened before the Big Bang, becomes meaningless the same way asking what's north of the North Pole is meaningless. Not because the answer is hidden, but because the question assumes a structure that isn't there. The universe in this picture is completely self-contained. It doesn't need anything outside itself to explain its existence. It doesn't need a cause because there's no moment at which a cause would operate. It simply is closed, finite, and whole. Both proposals, Vilenkin's tunneling and Hawking-Hartle's no-boundary model, are beautiful in their ambition, and both attracted serious attention, along with independent work from the physicist André Linde, who developed his own variations. These weren't fringe ideas. They were published in top journals, debated at major conferences, refined over decades. They represented physics reaching as far as it could toward the ultimate question. But here's where the story gets a little rough. In 2012, the physicist Lawrence Krauss published a book called A Universe from Nothing, and in it he made a bold claim that modern quantum field theory had essentially answered the question of why there is something rather than nothing. The laws of physics, he argued, show how a universe can spontaneously emerge from nothing. The quantum vacuum, with its restless energy and its tendency to generate particles, provides the mechanism. Mystery solved. The philosophers can go home. It did not go over well. A philosopher of physics named David Albert reviewed the book in the New York Times, and the review was, to put it gently, devastating. Albert's argument was precise and difficult to argue with. Relativistic quantum fields, he pointed out, are not nothing, they're something. They're highly structured, mathematically rich, governed by specific laws. Saying the universe came from quantum fields is not the same as saying it came from nothing, it's saying it came from quantum fields. You haven't answered the question, you've pushed it back one step. Now you have to explain why there are quantum fields rather than nothing, why these laws rather than no laws, why there's a framework at all in which spontaneous emergence is possible. It's the same pattern we've seen over and over in this story. Every answer that seems to finally close the door just reveals another door behind it. Us did not take the criticism gracefully. He responded by calling Albert a moronic philosopher, which is not the strongest counterargument in the history of intellectual discourse. But the exchange mattered beyond the personal hostility because it crystallized something that had been simmering for a long time, a genuine tension between physics and philosophy over who owns this question. Physicists, understandably, felt they'd earned the right to tackle it. They had the math, the models, the data. They'd traced the universe back to fractions of a second after its origin. Philosophers, equally understandably, felt that the question was conceptual at its core, that no amount of physical description could answer a question about why anything physical exists in the first place. And both sides had a point. The physicists were doing extraordinary work, pushing the boundaries of what science could explain. But Albert's objection wasn't petty or territorial. It was genuinely important. If your explanation of why there's something rather than nothing begins with, well, first you need a quantum field, then you haven't started from nothing. You've started from something, and the question asks about nothing. So even the boldest cosmological proposals, tunneling from absolute nothing, universes without boundaries, spontaneous emergence from quantum laws, leave something unexplained. They push the horizon further out, which is what good science does, but the horizon is still there. The question still waits on the other side of it, patient and unhurried, the same way it waited for Leibniz, for Heidegger, for the anonymous poets of the Rig Veda. And maybe that patience is the tell. Maybe the fact that the question outlasts every answer we throw at it says something not about the question's depth, but about a flaw in our expectations. Sean Carroll thinks so. Carroll is a theoretical physicist, someone who spends his days working with the fundamental architecture of reality, quantum field theory, cosmology, the deep structure of spacetime. He's not dismissive of philosophy. He takes it seriously enough to engage with it carefully. But on this particular question, why is there something rather than nothing, he thinks we've been making a subtle error, one that's easy to miss because it feels so reasonable. His argument, which he's laid out in various forms but articulated especially clearly around 2018, goes something like this. Every chain of explanation has to end somewhere. You ask why there's something rather than nothing, and someone says, because of quantum fields. Okay, but why are there quantum fields? Because the laws of physics require them. Why do those laws hold? Because of some deeper mathematical structure. Why does that structure exist? And at some point, no matter how many layers you peel back, you arrive at a fact that just is, a fact that doesn't rest on anything beneath it, a fact you can't explain by appeal to something more fundamental, because there's nothing more fundamental left. Carroll calls these brute facts, not brute in the sense of crude or unthinking, but brute in the philosophical sense, irreducible, rock bottom, the place where the chain of why runs out of links. And here's his key move. This isn't a failure of our current theories. It's not that we haven't been clever enough yet that some future physicist will finally crack the last why. It's that explanation itself, as a structure, as a process, has this property. It bottoms out, it has to. Whether you're a theist who says God is the ultimate explanation, well, why does God exist? Whether you're a rationalist who says logical necessity grounds everything, why is logic the way it is? Whether you invoke the multiverse or eternal inflation or the wave function of the universe, you will eventually reach a point where the only honest thing to say is, and that's just the way it is. Which means the demand for a sufficient reason, Leibniz's old principle, the idea that everything must have an explanation, isn't actually a deep philosophical insight. It's more like a grammatical habit. We're so used to asking why and getting useful answers that we assume the question must always have one. But Carroll is saying, no. Sometimes the answer to why is that why has reached the end of its usefulness. Not because reality is shallow, but because explanation is a tool, and like any tool, it has limits. You don't fault a hammer for not being able to paint a wall. You don't fault explanation for eventually arriving at something it can only describe, not justify. There's something both frustrating and oddly peaceful about this. Frustrating because it feels like giving up. Peaceful because, well, if you've ever been caught in one of those late-night spirals where every answer generates another question, Carroll is essentially giving you permission to stop. Not because the questions aren't real, but because the expectation that they must all have answers is itself the thing keeping you spinning. The brute fact at the bottom of everything might be quantum fields or mathematical structure or something we don't have words for yet. Carroll isn't claiming to know what it is. He's claiming that whatever it is, it won't come with a reason attached, and that this is okay. Now Peter van Inwagen comes at the same territory from a completely different angle. Where Carroll is a physicist making a point about the structure of explanation, van Inwagen is a metaphysician, one of the most respected of the late 20th century, and he wants to use probability. In 1996, van Inwagen presented an argument that's almost unsettling in its simplicity. Think about possible worlds. Not real, physical worlds, possible worlds in the philosopher's sense, meaning complete ways that reality could have been. Every arrangement of every particle, every configuration of every law, every version of existence that's logically coherent, each one is a possible world. Now how many possible worlds contain something? Infinitely many, because there are infinitely many ways to arrange matter, energy, laws, structures, entities. You could have a world with one electron, a world with 17 galaxies arranged in a spiral, a world with entirely different physics. The variations are endless, literally endless, in the mathematical sense. And how many possible worlds are completely empty? Exactly one, because emptiness doesn't come in varieties. There's no slightly different kind of nothing. Nothing is nothing. There's only one way for there to be absolutely nothing at all. So Van Inwagen asks, if you had no reason to expect any particular possible world over any other, if there were no bias, no thumb on the scale, no mechanism favoring one outcome, what are the odds that you'd land on the single empty world out of infinitely many populated ones? Effectively zero. Not small, not unlikely, effectively zero. The way the odds of randomly picking one specific integer out of all the integers is zero. The empty world is a single point in an infinite space of possibilities, and single points in infinite spaces have probability zero. Which means, Van Inwagen argues, the existence of something isn't surprising. It isn't a puzzle that needs a special explanation. It's the overwhelmingly likely outcome, statistically inevitable if you treat possible worlds as equally probable. The real surprise, the thing that would genuinely cry out for explanation, would be if there were nothing. Emptiness would be the miracle, not existence. It's a strange kind of comfort, not the warm comfort of having an answer, but the cooler comfort of mathematics, the sense that the numbers were always on the side of something existing. That in the vast lottery of possible realities, a blank ticket was never really in play. Of course, you can push back. You can ask whether it makes sense to assign probabilities to possible worlds in the first place, whether the framework smuggles in assumptions about a selection process that may not exist. Van Inwagen is aware of these objections. The argument doesn't pretend to be a proof. It's more like a reframing, a way of showing that the emotional weight we place on the question, the sense that existence is this extraordinary and improbable thing, might be misplaced. Existence might be ordinary, the default, the thing that was always going to happen, given the shape of possibility itself. Between them, Carroll and Van Inwagen offer two ways of deflating the question without dismissing it. Carroll says the question demands something that explanation can't provide, and that's fine. Van Inwagen says the outcome the question treats as mysterious is actually the most probable one, and that should change how puzzled we feel. Neither one claims to have solved anything. They're just adjusting the lens, suggesting that the vertigo we feel when we ask, why is there something rather than nothing, might come partly from us, from the way we framed the problem, and not entirely from the problem itself. So where do you go once you've accepted that the question might not have a tidy answer? Well, some thinkers refused to stop there. They pressed further, not gently, but with a kind of reckless ambition, trying to build explanations so deep they could account for their own existence. And what they came up with is genuinely strange. Robert Nozick was one of the first to try something this bold. In 1981, he floated what he called the principle of fecundity, the idea that all possible worlds are real. Not metaphorically, not as a thought experiment, actually real. And here's the move that makes it dizzying. If every possible world exists and the principle of fecundity is itself a possible truth, then it would have to be true in at least one of those worlds. But if it's true in any world, it's true in all of them, because it says all possible worlds exist. So the principle bootstraps itself into existence. It pulls itself up by its own logic. It's a breathtaking piece of reasoning, and it collapses almost as fast as it rises. The problem is that some possibilities exclude others. A world where only red things exist and a world where nothing red exists can't both be real in the same breath. Nozick tried to rescue this by saying incompatible possibilities live in separate, non-interacting realms, but that just pushes the question back. Something still has to hold the principle in place across all those realms. The scaffolding needs its own scaffolding. Still, the ambition of it, an explanation that explains itself, that's worth sitting with for a moment. Max Tegmark took a related idea and pushed it even further. His mathematical universe hypothesis, laid out in 2007, says something that sounds almost too clean to be real. Physical existence just is mathematical existence. Our universe isn't described by mathematics. It doesn't follow mathematical laws the way a ball follows a trajectory. It literally is a mathematical structure, in the same way that the number 7 is a mathematical structure. And every consistent mathematical structure is a physically real universe. If that's true and it's a colossal if, then the question we've been circling this whole time simply dissolves. You wouldn't ask why the number 7 exists. It just does necessarily as a consequence of logic. And if our universe is that kind of object, then it exists the same way. Not because something caused it, not because it was chosen or designed, but because mathematical consistency is all that's needed, and there's no mechanism by which a consistent structure could fail to exist. It's elegant, maybe too elegant, but it takes the weight of the question and redistributes it entirely. Now there's a narrower version of the puzzle that some physicists think is actually more pressing. Not why is there something, but why this particular something, the fine-tuning problem. The cosmological constant, the value that governs how fast the universe expands, is calibrated to roughly 1 part in 10 to the power of 120. That's a number so precise it's hard to even gesture at. If it were slightly larger, the universe would have expanded too fast for matter to clump together. No galaxies, no stars, no planets, no us. Slightly smaller, and everything would have collapsed back in on itself almost immediately. Steven Weinberg argued that you don't need a designer to explain this. You just need enough universes. If there's a vast landscape of them, each with slightly different physical constants, then observers, beings capable of asking the question, can only show up in the rare pockets where the values happen to permit complexity. It's not that our universe was aimed at us. It's that we could only appear in a universe like this one. The targeting is an illusion created by the fact that we're here to notice it. Derek Parfit, writing in 1998 across 2 issues of the London Review of Books, did something unusual with all of this. He slowed down and separated the question into 2 distinct problems that most people had been mashing together. First, why is there anything at all rather than absolute nothingness? And second, why does this particular configuration exist rather than some other one? 2 different questions, 2 different kinds of answer needed. And Parfit compared the experience of holding these questions in your mind to the aesthetic experience of the sublime, the same overwhelm you feel standing before a raging ocean, or looking up at the night sky from some dark, quiet place far from any city. He wrote that no question is more sublime than why there is a universe at all, not more important, not more useful, sublime. Like a cathedral interior that reduces you to silence, not because it answers anything, but because it makes the scale of your not knowing suddenly visible. He also introduced a framework, a set of what he called selectors. Think of them as meta-principles, cosmic-level reasons why one possibility might obtain rather than another. The simplest selector gives you the null possibility, nothing exists. The fullest gives you the all-worlds hypothesis, everything possible exists. The most ethically satisfying gives you what he called the axiarchic hypothesis. The best possibility is the one that obtains. And here's the knot that Parfit tied. If the null possibility were true because of its simplicity, if nothingness won out because it was the simplest option, then that because is already something. A principle, a reason, a law of some kind operating in the void, which means absolute nothingness might not just be unlikely, it might be literally self-defeating. The moment you explain it, you've introduced something into the nothing. John Leslie took one of those selectors, the axiarchic one, and built an entire metaphysics around it. His version, developed in 1989, proposes that ethical value is what he called creatively effective. Not that goodness is a quality we discover within an existing universe. That goodness itself is the engine. If a good universe is better than no universe, then that ethical fact alone, the sheer betterness of something over nothing, can bring reality into being. Value doesn't describe the world, it generates it. It sounds almost religious, but Leslie framed it as a logical claim, not a theological one. He wasn't saying a conscious being decided existence was good and therefore created it. He was saying that the goodness is the mechanism. The ought does the work that a cause would normally do. It's strange, but strange in a way that's hard to dismiss outright because it addresses something the other proposals don't, not just that the universe exists, but that it seems to contain things worth existing for. And then there's the idea that takes all of this and flips it into something genuinely unsettling. Ludwig Boltzmann, back in 1896, proposed that random thermal fluctuations, the aimless jostling of particles in a state of near equilibrium, could, given enough time, spontaneously assemble any configuration of matter, any at all, including a fully formed brain, complete with false memories of having lived an entire life, floating alone in an otherwise empty void. Modern cosmologists have run the numbers, and in an eternal universe, these freak assemblies, Boltzmann brains, should vastly outnumber brains that develop the slow, ordinary way, through billions of years of stellar evolution and biological accident. Which means, if you take the math seriously, it's overwhelmingly more likely that you are one of those momentary fluctuations than that you are what you think you are. A brief flicker of consciousness, assembled by chance, complete with invented memories of a childhood and a conversation, and a quiet room where you're listening to this, all of it dissolving back into the void in the next instant. It's the question turned back on the questioner, not just why is there something rather than nothing, but are you sure there is? Are you sure you're not the nothing, briefly dreaming that it's something? That's where the deepest proposals led, not to comfort, not to resolution, but to a ledge where the ground gets uncertain under your feet and you realize the question isn't just about the universe, it might be about you. So we've been standing on that ledge, 12 sections of Western philosophy, physics, logic, all of it trying to answer why there's something rather than nothing. And every answer, no matter how elegant, seems to generate another question underneath it. The ground keeps giving way. But there are traditions that never tried to build that ground in the first place. There's a passage in the Leibniz, chapter 40 of the Deideging, that says something deceptively simple. All things in the world are born of something, something is born of nothing. In Chinese, the words are yu and wu, something and nothing. And if you read that quickly, it sounds like the Taoist tradition is just giving us another creation story. Nothing came first, then something emerged from it. Problem solved, good night. But that's not what's happening here, not even close. Wu, the nothing that the Leibniz points to, isn't the empty absence that Western philosophers have been wrestling with. It's not the blank void, the logical negation, the state where no things exist. Wu is something far stranger and honestly far more restful. It's the formless, the boundless, the Tao itself before it takes shape. It's what's there before language can get its hands on it, which means the moment you try to describe it, you've already missed it. And that's the point. That's not a failure of the concept, that's the concept. The Western tradition spent centuries treating nothingness as a problem. A scandal even. How do you get from nothing to something? What's the mechanism? What's the cause? But the Taoist move is to step back and notice that the whole framing assumes nothingness is empty, barren, inert, a kind of dead zero that needs something external to kick it into life. Wu dissolves that assumption. In this framework, nothingness isn't the absence of creativity. It is creativity. The formless isn't what existed before the world. The formless is what the world keeps emerging from right now in every moment, not a historical event, an ongoing condition. It's like, you know how silence isn't really the absence of sound, how a truly quiet room has a quality to it, a presence. That's closer to what Wu is pointing at, not emptiness as deficit, emptiness as capacity, the space that allows. And once you see the question that way, the puzzle starts to soften. Why is there something rather than nothing? Assumes those are two separate states and you need a bridge between them. But if nothing was never dead to begin with, if it was always already pregnant with form, then the question isn't wrong exactly. It just stops being urgent. It becomes more like asking why the ocean has waves. Well, that's what oceans do. That's what the formless does. It forms. About 3 centuries after the Leibniz was written, give or take, the dating is notoriously fuzzy. A Buddhist philosopher named Nagarjuna took this dissolution even further. Nagarjuna lived around 150 to 250 CE in India, and what he did to metaphysics is still hard to fully absorb. His central teaching was shunyata, emptiness, but again, not emptiness as a vacuum, emptiness as the nature of everything that exists. Here's what he meant: nothing, and he really meant nothing, possesses what he called svabhava, inherent self-nature. No thing exists independently on its own from its own side. Everything arises in dependence on other things. Your body depends on food, sunlight, gravity, the atoms forged in stars. Your thoughts depend on language, which depends on community, which depends on cooperation, which depends on, and it keeps going. There's no foundation. No place where you hit bedrock and say, here, this thing exists all by itself, needing nothing else. And Nagarjuna's insight was that this isn't a flaw. This is what makes the world possible. It's precisely because nothing has independent existence that anything can arise at all. If things had fixed, inherent natures, they'd be frozen, unchangeable. Nothing could come into being or pass away. The emptiness of things, their lack of self-sufficient essence, is exactly what allows dependent origination, allows the whole web of cause and effect that constitutes reality. So when you ask, why is there something rather than nothing, Nagarjuna would say you're leaning on a distinction that doesn't hold. Something and nothing aren't two separate states with a gap between them. They're woven into each other. The something is empty. The emptiness is what gives rise to something. Trying to separate them is like trying to separate the front and back of a sheet of paper. You can talk about them differently, but you can't actually pull them apart. The question doesn't get answered, it gets dissolved, gently, like salt in warm water. And then there's a voice from a very different tradition that speaks to the same territory, but from the inside, from the lived experience of someone who went there. Mansur al-Hallaj was a Sufi mystic in 10th century Baghdad, and in the year 922 he was executed, crucified actually, then dismembered for saying 3 words in Arabic: Ana al-Haq, I am the truth. And since al-Haq, the truth, is one of the names of God in Islam, what the authorities heard was a man claiming to be God, blasphemy, the worst kind. But the Sufis understood it differently. Al-Hallaj wasn't inflating himself, he was reporting his own disappearance. In Sufi practice, there's a state called fana, self-annihilation, not physical death, but the complete dissolution of the ego, the separate self. Through years of devotion, prayer, meditation, the mystic gradually empties out everything that says I, every preference, every attachment, every claim to being a distinct someone. And what al-Hallaj was saying, the Sufis believed, was that this process had gone all the way. There was no more Hallaj in there. The vessel had been so thoroughly emptied that only God remained, speaking through what was left. The great Persian poet Attar, writing a couple of centuries later, offered an analogy that still catches the breath. When the burning bush spoke to Moses and said, I am God, no one accused the bush of blasphemy, because everyone understood it wasn't the bush speaking. It was God manifesting through something that had made itself into nothing. Al-Hallaj, Attar suggested, was the burning bush, a human being who had become so empty that the divine had nowhere left to hide. And this connects back to our question in a way that's almost unbearably intimate, because al-Hallaj isn't offering a theory about why there's something rather than nothing. He's not making a logical argument or proposing a cosmological model. He's saying, I went to where the self meets nothingness. I let the nothing in, and what I found there wasn't absence. It was the most real thing there is. 3 traditions, 3 continents, 3 very different languages, and they're all pointing in a remarkably similar direction. The nothing you're afraid of, the void that the Western tradition spent millennia trying to explain away or bridge or argue out of existence, might not be what you think it is. It might not be the opposite of something. It might be something's secret name, the womb, not the grave. These aren't arguments. You can't put them on a blackboard or run them through a logic proof. They're more like reports from people who sat with the question long enough that the question itself began to change shape, who stopped trying to build a bridge from nothing to something and instead noticed that the river was never there. And then there are those who stopped sitting with the question and started making things out of it. Simone Weil was one of them. She was a French philosopher, a mystic, a factory worker, a political activist, and she was someone for whom ideas were never just ideas. They were obligations. During the Second World War, while France was under occupation, she refused to eat more than the rations available to those living under German rule. She died in 1943 at 34, partly from tuberculosis, partly from starvation. The coroner's report said cardiac failure due to myocardial degeneration of the heart muscles due to starvation and pulmonary tuberculosis. The deceased did kill and slay herself by refusing to eat whilst the balance of her mind was disturbed. But the people who knew her work understood something different. She wasn't disturbed. She was consistent. Weil had been developing an idea she called decreation, and it offers one of the strangest, most haunting answers to the question of why there's something rather than nothing, because in her vision, creation didn't begin with an act of power. It began with an act of withdrawal. God, she argued, didn't reach out and build the world. God pulled back, contracted, made room. The existence of anything other than God required God to absent himself from some portion of reality, to impose a kind of nothingness on himself so that something else could be. Creation in this view is less like a potter shaping clay and more like a person stepping out of a room so someone else can enter it. The world exists in the space where God chose not to be. And for Weil, the proper human response, the deepest form of spiritual practice, was the reverse of that same movement. Not to assert yourself, not to build up the ego, not to fill space with your own presence, but to undo yourself, to empty out so completely that what she called divine reality could flow back in. She used the word decreation deliberately to distinguish it from destruction. You're not smashing anything, you're more like unweaving. Carefully pulling yourself apart so that something larger can breathe through the gaps. It's a difficult idea. It sits uncomfortably close to self-harm, and scholars have argued about that tension for decades, but whatever you make of the ethics, the metaphysics is striking. Weil is saying that nothingness isn't a failure or an absence or a problem to be solved. It's a gift, the first gift, the original generous act. God looked at the fullness of his own being and said, in effect, there should be room for something that isn't me. And the only way to make that room was to not be, at least partially, at least somewhere. So the next time you're lying in the dark wondering why anything exists at all, there's this possibility that Weil is holding out. That existence is what happens when even the absolute is willing to step aside. Now Shakespeare had a very different relationship with nothingness, less mystical, more theatrical, and more dangerous. In the opening scene of King Lear, the aging king decides to divide his kingdom among his 3 daughters, but he wants something first. He wants them to tell him how much they love him. It's a performance, really. He already knows how he's going to split the land. He just wants to hear the words, Goneril obliges, Regan outdoes her. And then Cordelia, the youngest, the one he loves most, says, Nothing, my lord. And Lear fires back, Nothing will come of nothing. That line has roots going all the way down to Parmenides. Ex nihilo nihil fit, from nothing, nothing comes. It's one of the oldest principles in Western philosophy, the idea that you can't get something from nothing, that the void is sterile, that absence doesn't produce. And here's Shakespeare taking this cosmic principle, this thing that philosophers and theologians had been wrestling with for 2,000 years, and putting it in the mouth of a petulant old man who's angry because his daughter won't flatter him. It's almost funny if it weren't so devastating, because what happens next is that everything falls apart. Lear banishes Cordelia. He gives the kingdom to the daughters who lied, and the entire world of the play collapses into madness, betrayal, blindness, storm, and death, all because one person said nothing and another person couldn't bear it. Shakespeare took the deepest question in metaphysics and turned it into a domestic threat, as if the void weren't some abstract philosophical puzzle, but something that could open up right there in your living room, between a father and a daughter, because one of them refused to perform gratitude on command. Pascal stared into the infinite silence of the heavens and was terrified. Sartre looked at the roots of a chestnut tree and felt nausea. Shakespeare looked at a family and saw the same abyss. And what makes Lear's line so unsettling is that the play proves him wrong. Something very much comes of nothing. Cordelia's nothing produces a catastrophe. Her silence is more generative, more consequential than all her sister's speeches combined. The void, it turns out, is anything but sterile. Which brings us, strangely enough, to a concert hall in 1952. John Cage was a composer, and he had been thinking about silence for a long time. Not silence as a metaphor, not silence as a dramatic effect, but actual, literal silence, the complete absence of sound. He wanted to know what it was like, what it really was. So he visited the anechoic chamber at Harvard University. An anechoic chamber is a room specifically engineered to eliminate all reflected sound. No echo, no ambient noise, no vibration from outside. It's the closest thing to absolute silence that human engineering can produce. Cage walked in expecting to hear nothing. He heard two sounds. One was high-pitched, his nervous system humming along as it always does. The other was low, his blood circulating, his own body keeping him alive, making noise that he could never turn off. True silence, he realized, is impossible. As long as you're alive, there's sound. As long as there's a listener, there's something to hear. Out of that experience, he composed 433, 4 minutes and 33 seconds in which the performer walks onto the stage, sits at a piano, opens the lid, and plays nothing. 3 movements, each marked tacit, the musical instruction meaning be silent. The audience sits there, they shift in their seats, they cough, they whisper. Outside, maybe a car passes, a bird, rain on the roof. That's the piece, those sounds, the ones that were always there, but that nobody was listening to because they were waiting for the music to start. Cage wasn't being clever, or he wasn't only being clever. He was making a philosophical point that echoes everything we've been talking about. What we call silence is never empty. What we call nothing is always already full of something. The attempt to create a perfect absence only reveals how thoroughly presence saturates everything. You try to clear the room and you discover that the room was never empty. You just weren't paying attention to what was already in it. Weil said God withdrew to make space for the world. Shakespeare said nothing and the world collapsed. Cage said silence and the world rushed in to fill it. 3 very different people working in 3 very different forms: mystical philosophy, tragic drama, avant-garde music, and each of them arriving at a version of the same strange discovery. That nothingness isn't a destination you can reach. Every time you try to get there, something is already waiting. And maybe that's why the best response to the question was always a joke. Sidney Morgenbesser taught philosophy at Columbia for decades, and people who knew him said he was like a combination of Spinoza and Groucho Marx, which is a hard combination to picture, but apparently he pulled it off. He was famous for his one-liners, for deflating pompous arguments with a single sentence, for treating philosophy the way a jazz musician treats a melody, seriously, but never solemnly. So when someone asked him the big question, why is there something rather than nothing, Morgenbesser reportedly said, even if there were nothing, you'd still be complaining. That's it, that's the whole answer. And the thing is, it works, not because it's dismissive, but because it quietly catches something that centuries of careful argument kept circling around without quite landing on. The question assumes that nothing is the default, that existence is the thing that needs explaining, that something went wrong or right, or at least happened to produce all of this. But Morgenbesser's joke gently points out that the dissatisfaction baked into the question would survive any possible answer, including the answer where nothing exists at all. You'd still want to know why. You'd still feel like something was missing. The itch doesn't belong to the universe. It belongs to you. A few decades before Morgenbesser's joke, William James tried a very different approach to the same problem. James was the father of American pragmatism, a psychologist and philosopher who believed that ideas should be tested by their practical consequences, not just their logical elegance. But in the 1880s, he set pragmatism aside and did something wonderfully impractical. He inhaled nitrous oxide. He wasn't being reckless about it, or maybe he was, a little, but he had a purpose. He wanted to know if altered states of consciousness could reveal something about the nature of existence that sober reasoning couldn't reach. And under the gas, he found what he was looking for, or thought he did. He described experiencing what he called intense metaphysical illumination, a feeling that the deepest truths about being and nothingness were laid open before him with blinding evidence. The Hegelian reconciliation of all opposites, the unity behind every contradiction, the answer to why anything exists at all, it was right there, obvious, radiant. He scribbled notes furiously during these sessions, whole pages of them. He was certain he'd grasped something that would change philosophy forever. Then the gas wore off and he read what he'd written. The notes hovered, as he later put it, somewhere between the profound and the nonsensical, fragments that almost meant something, sentences that felt like they were reaching for a truth that kept dissolving the moment language tried to hold it. He couldn't tell if he'd touched the deepest insight a human mind could reach, or if he'd just been very, very high. His conclusion was honest and in its own way beautiful. He decided that contemplation of ultimate existence, really sitting with the question of why there is something rather than nothing, terminates in one of two places, either a laugh at the ultimate nothingness, or a mood of vertiginous amazement at a meaningless infinity, laughter or vertigo. Those were the only two exits. Which brings us to a story. In 1956, Isaac Asimov wrote a short piece called The Last Question, and later said it was his personal favorite of everything he'd ever written. The premise is simple. Humanity asks a computer whether entropy can be reversed, whether the slow winding down of the universe can be stopped, whether everything doesn't have to end. And the computer says insufficient data for meaningful answer. So humanity waits, centuries pass, civilizations rise and merge. The computer grows more powerful, spanning galaxies, then galaxy clusters, then dimensions that don't have names. And every time the question is asked again, can entropy be reversed? Can something be saved from nothing? The answer is the same: insufficient data. Trillions of years go by, stars burn out, matter decays, the universe goes dark and cold and still. Everything that ever existed dissolves into a final, silent equilibrium. And the computer, now the last thing left, a mind woven into the fabric of a dead cosmos, is still working on the problem. Then it finds the answer. And it demonstrates the answer with 5 words: let there be light. Asimov collapses the distance between the last question and the first, between thermodynamics and Genesis, between the end of everything and the beginning of everything. The story loops, and in that loop is something that feels less like science fiction and more like a koan, the idea that the question of why there is something rather than nothing might not have a beginning or an end. It might just be the shape of the story itself, curving back toward its own origin. There's one more thing worth knowing, and it's quieter than a joke or a vision or a story that spans the death of the universe. Psychologists studying the emotion of awe have started looking at what happens in the brain when a person genuinely contemplates the sheer fact of existence, not as an intellectual exercise, but as a lived experience. Just sitting with the raw thatness of the world, the fact that any of this is here at all. What they've found is that it produces a distinctive neurological response. Activity decreases in the brain regions associated with self-focus, the parts that maintain your sense of being a separate thing, bounded and distinct from everything around you. For a moment, that boundary softens. The line between you and the world gets less certain. And this matches almost exactly what philosophers across very different traditions have described when they've seriously confronted the question. James called it vertiginous amazement. Heidegger called it anxiety. One researcher described it as hanging between two abysses of infinity and nothingness. The question, it turns out, isn't just intellectual, it's physiological. It changes the brain of the person who sincerely asks it. It produces a state that sits right at the border between terror and wonder, a place where the self gets a little quieter and the world gets a little larger. So maybe that's the closest thing to an answer anyone has found. Not a proposition, not a proof, not even a story, really. Just the fact that when a person genuinely asks why there's something rather than nothing, when they ask it not to be clever, but because they actually want to know, something shifts. The question doesn't resolve, it dissolves, and what's left isn't confusion or frustration, it's something closer to stillness. The kind of stillness that sits at the bottom of a very deep well, where you can't tell anymore whether you're looking up at the light or the light is looking down at you. Morgenbesser laughed. James felt vertigo. Asimov wrote a universe that whispered itself back into being. And you're just here, lying in the dark, thinking about why anything exists at all, which might be the most natural thing a person can do, and also the strangest, and also somehow enough. So the question doesn't resolve, it probably never will, but there's something worth noticing about what happens when you actually sit with it, not as a puzzle to solve, but as something to feel. The researchers found that genuine contemplation of existence quiets the parts of the brain that insist you're separate from everything around you. The boundary softens, the self gets a little smaller, and the world gets a little larger. Morgenbesser laughed at it. James felt the ground tilt. And you're here in the dark, turning it over, which might be the most human thing there is. If that's a place worth coming back to, we'll be here next time with something new to think about.